What's up guys, glad to see y'all for another video. Today, I'm gonna break down why Dae-ho's arc failed to live up to the hype. By the time Squid Game Season 3 was over, I noticed something about the way people were talking about Dae-ho. Nobody was really defending him. Nobody was warning him either. Most people were just annoyed, including myself. And that's weird, because Dae-ho wasn't introduced as a throwaway character. He wasn't background noise. He was set up with intention, with moral weight, with internal conflict, and with the kind of positioning that usually leads somewhere important. Early on, it felt like the show wanted us to pay attention to him, like his choices were going to matter, like his arc was going to say something about survival, loyalty, or what the games do to people who hesitate instead of act. But by the end of Season 3, Dae-ho isn't tragic, he isn't complex, he isn't even controversial in an interesting way. He becomes an extension of Gi-hoon's trauma, and all the build-up was for nothing. Not because he's a bad person, but because the story slowly strips him of consistency, agency, and purpose. Scene by scene, decision by decision, his arc stops feeling intentional and starts feeling mishandled. So in this video, I want to break down how Squid Game managed to take a character with real potential and turn him into one of the weakest characters in Season 3. Where Dae-ho starts, where the writing goes wrong, and why his downfall doesn't feel devastating, it just feels empty. Before anyone protests this hot take, I do want to confess that I did enjoy Dae-ho in Season 2. His character in Season 3 just completely shifted how I felt about him after. This is not about blaming the actor or nitpicking scenes. It's about how a show that's usually brutal with precision completely fumbles one of its most promising setups, and once you see where Dae-ho's arc breaks, it's hard to unsee it. When Dae-ho is introduced, the show very clearly wants us to see him as more than just another player. On the surface, he's an ex-military character, something Squid Game should have dove into more. But almost immediately, there's a noticeable difference in how he's portrayed. During the rebellion at the end of Season 2, Dae-ho isn't confident, he isn't aggressive, he doesn't lean into authority or strength. Instead, he's nervous, jittery, and emotionally reactive in moments where you'd expect a trained soldier to be calm. That contrast is important. In Season 2, a lot of viewers, myself included, read Dae-ho as a portrayal of a veteran dealing with PTSD. During the rebellion, when he freezes, when his hands shake, and when he refuses to return the ammo, it doesn't come across as cowardice. It feels like a trauma response. The show frames it in a way that suggests fear isn't his flaw, it's something he's actively struggling to control. That interpretation is reinforced when Dae-ho talks about his past. He explains that his father forced him into becoming a Marine, and it's clear that this wasn't a choice rooted in pride or passion. It was obligation, pressure, a life path imposed on him by someone he never really respected or connected with. That detail matters because it recontextualizes everything we see from him in the games. It would have been very interesting if Squid Game would have gone with the route of a PTSD veteran, shedding some light on the trauma that they face and bringing awareness about their situations. Dae-ho isn't someone who chose violence. He's someone who is punished and into it, and never fully processed what it did to him. This is where Jung-bae comes in. Jung-bae slowly fills the role of a surrogate father figure for Dae-ho, something the show makes subtle but consistent. Jung-bae offers guidance without force. He gives Dae-ho reassurance along with commands based on their shared experience. And most importantly, he treats him like a person, not a tool or a disappointment. For someone who grew up under a controlling, militaristic father, that kind of support changes everything. It explains why Dae-ho gravitates toward him so strongly, and why his loyalty feels emotional rather than strategic. And outside of the heavy stuff, Dae-ho is just likable. He's energetic, he jokes, he lightens scenes that would otherwise be unbearable. Other characters trust him quickly, and so does the audience. There's a reason people started comparing him to Ali from Season 1. He felt like the heart of the group, someone innocent enough to root for, but grounded enough to survive. At least, that's what it looked like at first. Because by the end of Season 3, that Ali comparison doesn't just fall apart, it feels almost ironic. Not because Dae-ho was never set up to be that character, but because the show abandons what he was clearly meant to represent. And that's where his arc starts to break. Dae-ho's arc doesn't slowly fall apart over the course of Season 3. It breaks almost immediately. Within the first few minutes of the season, Yong-sik tells Gi-hoon that the failed rebellion was Dae-ho's fault, that if he had brought back the ammo, everything would have gone differently. And the moment that information lands, the show makes a very clear choice. The blame sticks. There's no investigation, no nuance, no attempt to reframe what happened as fear, trauma, or panic under pressure. Instead, the narrative simplifies it into cause and effect. Dae-ho didn't return the ammo, so people died. End of discussion. And once Gi-hoon internalizes that, Dae-ho's fate is basically sealed. From that point on, Gi-hoon doesn't just resent Dae-ho, he wants him dead. The tension isn't subtle either. The show wants us to feel that something irreversible has shifted, especially once we learn that the fourth game is hide and seek. Gi-hun ends up on the red team, armed with a knife. Dae-ho is on the blue team. In that moment, the outcome stops feeling uncertain. It feels pre-written. What makes this the breaking point of Dae-ho's arc isn't just a conflict, it's what the show removes from him. Jong-bae is gone. His team is gone. The emotional buffer that once contextualized his fear no longer exists. Without such a support system, Season 3 doesn't explore Dae-ho's trauma, it flattens him. He's no longer portrayed as conflicted or overwhelmed. He's portrayed as a coward. Worse than that, he becomes erratic, defensive, occasionally aggressive. Traits that feel less like natural progression and more like the writers scrambling to justify what they're about to do with him. And then his arc ends, almost embarrassingly fast. In under a minute, Dae-ho explains that he never even did combat training as a Marine, that he joined Gi-hun because he wanted to be cool like them, that he just wanted to be part of the group. A confession that doesn't deepen his character, it erases it. This moment doesn't reframe his fear as trauma, it reframes his entire identity as a fraud. At that point, Dae-ho stops being a character and starts being a function. His death isn't about him, it's about Gi-hun. It exists to show how broken Gi-hun has become, that he's finally capable of killing someone directly. Dae-ho doesn't die because his arc demanded it, he dies because the story needed proof of Gi-hun's collapse. And once that happens, everything Dae-ho was set up to represent in Season 2 becomes irrelevant. That's not tragedy, that's abandonment. Here's the thing, Dae-ho's actions at the end of Season 2 and the start of Season 3 aren't necessarily confusing. If someone froze during a violent rebellion, carried that guilt with them, lost the one person who grounded them, and then realized Gi-hun actively blamed them for everything that went wrong, fear would be a completely natural response. Anyone in that position would be terrified. The problem isn't what Dae-ho feels, it's how the show chose to show him. Every time Dae-ho appears in Season 3, the framing is the same. He's shaking, he's panicking, he's looking over his shoulder, or the camera cuts to Gi-hun staring at him like a threat that hasn't been dealt with yet. Over and over again, his presence exists only to remind us that he's afraid, or that someone else is angry at him. At that point, Dae-ho's arc stops being his own. We don't see any trace of the Season 2 version of him. No humor, no energy, no attempts to connect with people, no moments of warmth or humanity that once made him stand out. In fact, I didn't see a single scene in Season 3 where Dae-ho behaves the way he did before. That absence is what breaks the illusion. Yes, Season 3 was supposed to be brutal. The shift from hope into despair was intentional, something I talked about in the last video. But brutality works best when it distorts characters, not when it replaces them entirely. What Season 3 does with Dae-ho doesn't feel like deterioration, it feels like substitution. It genuinely feels like you're watching two different characters played by the same actor. And in a show like Squid Game, where psychological pressure is supposed to push people to their limits, character changes need to feel like natural extensions of who they already are. Fear can deepen a character, guilt can complicate them, trauma can fracture them, but none of those things should erase them. And that's exactly what happens here. Dae-ho doesn't evolve, he vanishes. What's left isn't a broken version of the same person, but a hollow outline used to carry tension from scene to scene. By the time his arc reaches its end, it doesn't feel tragic. It feels disconnected, like the show forgot who he was before it decided who he needed to be. And once that happens, the damage to his arc is already irreversible. Squid Game has never shied away from difficult, uncomfortable topics. Characters like Noel and Sae-byeok are defined by the hardships they endured in North Korea, the losses, the oppression, and the sacrifices. Hyunju's story tackles gender identity in a world that refuses to accept her, giving us a character whose struggles feel urgent, human, and real. The show doesn't just mention these traits as background, it builds them into the story. Every choice, every action, every moment of vulnerability matters. That's why these characters feel alive. That's why their arcs resonate and are deep. And that's exactly why Dae-ho's treatment in Season 3 feels so jarring. In Season 2, we saw the potential, a young ex-military man who carried trauma, fear, and guilt from his past. The hints were everywhere, his shaking during the rebellion, his hesitation to return the ammo, his complex relationship with his father, and his bond with Jong-bae. These were all opportunities to explore something meaningful, the daily struggles of veterans living with PTSD. The show could have offered a window into Dae-ho's internal life, showing how trauma manifests in fear, indecision, or misplaced loyalty. It could have been a socially relevant arc that felt lived in and believable. Instead, Season 3 almost completely discards all of that potential. Right from the start, Dae-ho is positioned as a liability, a target for blame. He's never given a chance to express his perspective, to defend himself, or to be understood by the people around him. The show doesn't explore the why behind his fear or his hesitation. It simply reframes it as failure. And when the story finally gives him a voice, it isn't about processing trauma or wrestling with fear. It's a confession. He never even used a gun in the Marines, only being a social service agent, and that supposedly explains why he deserves to die. The result is devastating, not in an emotional, story driven way, but in a narrative sense. Dae-ho's arc is stripped of complexity. The depth that Season 2 hinted at, a person who might have wrestled with guilt, sought guidance from Jungbei, or formed real bonds with his team, is gone. What remains is almost a caricature, a scared, reactive, expendable player. His identity, his struggle, his humanity are reduced to a single, functional purpose, to show how broken Gi-hun has become. This is especially painful when we compare Dae-ho to other characters in Season 3. Noel, Sabyok, Hyunju. Each of them deals with personal and societal pressures that are complicated and sometimes uncomfortable. They have traits that the normal person can't relate to, but the show invests in their arcs. We see their motivations, their pain, their attempts to survive or assert agency. That investment makes their moments of triumph or tragedy impactful. Dae-ho, by contrast, is denied that investment. His fear is punished, his past is erased, and his final moments are designed entirely to serve someone else's story. And it's not just a small misstep, it's a fundamental narrative failure. The groundwork was there for a resonant, socially relevant, and emotionally compelling storyline. Veterans struggling with PTSD, dealing with guilt, seeking guidance from mentors, trying to reconcile past trauma with present survival. That is powerful storytelling. Dae-ho had all the pieces to be that character, but Season 3 chooses convenience over depth, spectacle over substance, throwaway over thoughtful exploration. The tragedy isn't just that Dae-ho dies. The tragedy is that the arc could have been so much more, both for the story and for viewers who might have related to him. Instead, his story exists almost purely as a cautionary footnote, a reminder of what could have been, buried under a narrative that prioritizes other characters, tension, and shock value over the human story the show had set up. And that's why his arc, more than almost any other in Season 3, stands out as one of the most wasted. Not because the character isn't compelling, he was, but because the show refused to honor the potential it built in him. When you step back and look at Dae-ho's journey across Season 2 and 3, one thing becomes painfully clear. This was a character with immense potential that got completely discarded. In Season 2, Dae-ho showed complexity. He represented guilt and the struggle of someone forced into a violent life he didn't fully choose. He had bonds, subtle humor, and human warmth. Viewers could relate to him, root for him, and feel tension because of his internal conflict. Season 3 takes all of that away. Within minutes, he becomes a narrative prop, a character whose main function is to generate tension for Gi-hun. His motivations are flattened, his past erased, and his personality all but disappears. What could have been a story exploring PTSD, fear, and the cost of violence is reduced to a single loser confession and a death that serves someone else's arc. In that sense, Dae-ho's arc fails on multiple levels. It fails in character development. There's no growth or evolution, only regression. It fails in narrative utility. His purpose is no longer to explore human struggle, but to prop up another character's story. And it fails in emotional impact. Viewers aren't horrified, they're frustrated. We are not devastated by his downfall, we're disappointed by it. But there's an important lesson here, both for creators and viewers. Dae-ho's arc shows how much care matters in character writing. Even a character with immense promise can become hollow if the story decides convenience outweighs depth. And for us viewers, it's a reminder to pay attention to what makes characters meaningful. It's not just their actions, but how the story allows us to connect to their fears, struggles, and growth. So when you think about Dae-ho, it's worth asking, what could have been? How might the show have honored the trauma, the fear, and the humanity that made him compelling in the first place? The answers to those questions reveal not just the flaws of his arc, but the high standards the show can reach when it chooses to commit to a character fully. Ultimately, Dae-ho's arc in Season 3 isn't just disappointing, it's a cautionary tale about narrative neglect. It's proof that even a show as brilliant as Squid Game can stumble if it abandons the groundwork it laid for its characters. And that's why, when we look back, it's hard to think of another arc in the series that was so full of potential and yet so utterly wasted. It's disappointing, sure, but it also makes you appreciate the moments when Squid Game does handle its characters with care. Characters like Sabyok, Noel, and even Hyunju remind us what happens when the show fully commits to exploring someone's fears, trauma, and choices. So the next time you watch a character struggle or feel frustrated with the decision the writers make, think about Dae-ho. Think about what could have been and why the way a story treats its characters matters as much as the story itself. I want to hear what you think. Did you feel like Dae-ho's arc was ruined, or do you think Season 3 handled him in a way that made sense? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I would like to read them all, and I'd love to know your take. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. I've got more deep dives like this coming, and you don't want to miss them. And finally, if you're watching Squid Game closely, pay attention to the small moments in Season 3. Sometimes what's left unsaid is just as important as what's on screen. Hope you guys have a great day. Peace out.